This design is a little bit different because it has some parts that are stitched separately from the main hoop, the hoop that is going to have the dark purple fabric on it. Now, if you only have one hoop, like one 8-inch hoop, then you're going to want to do this step first because we'll stitch this and then you're going to remove this fabric out of this hoop and then you can put your purple fabric and transfer the main design on. If you own two hoops, then it doesn't necessarily have to be done first. You can have one hoop with your purple fabric and one hoop with this white fabric. But at some point, you're just going to need a hoop to put this white fabric in, stitch this up, and then we'll deal with these later. So let me show you how I have transferred this pattern on. You can see I've already done it here. You'll need your white fabric stretched in your hoop, obviously, and the pattern printed and cut out. And then you will need some sort of pen to transfer with. I like this Frixion erasable gel pen. I always say erasable because you can get the lines to go away with heat, but be aware that it does like to leave a little bit of a line. On white fabric, it leaves kind of a very faint yellow line. You can't always see it really, so it's not always that big of a deal. On dark fabrics, like if I were to write on the dark purple fabric with this and then take the hair dryer to it or iron to get rid of that line, it will leave a kind of a lighter line on it. And it's you can definitely see it. So keep that in mind, but although that's something you want to keep in mind with this, but I do love this pen. What I've done here is I have cut this out and I'll flip over my hoop, take this pattern face down, put it down in here, and then tape it like this to the back of the hoop. All right, then I will flip this over. I can hold this up to a bright sunny window, or if you have a light box, that works great too. But I just use my desk lamp. I hold it in front of there, and I'm going to press down on the fabric on the back so that the paper is really pressed up against that fabric. And then when I shine that bright light through it, I'll trace on the lines with this pen. You could, let me take this out. You could put this on this side like this, face down, and then when it's get a little bit strange because I've already got it traced, but see, this is the design. That way you'll be able to like press it onto. You could even just press it on when I lay it down on this white background, you don't even need the light. You can see very clearly because this fabric is the right weight, and because it's black lines on the white fabric, you can see without even doing the light behind it. I just tend to do it the other way because I like to keep my fabric in the hoop. I like to stitch on my fabric in the hoop this way. You can always do it like this and then switch the fabric. It's up to you. About the word box. If you are not going to be putting a word on your hoop, not everybody does since it's a separate thing, you can just stitch this up without having a word on it. That's fine. Lots of people do that. But if you do want to put a word, these looks the same, but this one is a little bit wider. There are 3 words on the list that are just a teeny bit longer, so they needed a box that was just a teensy bit wider. So if you're using one of those 3 words, it's noted in the pattern. Use this one below that is a little bit wider. If you're using any of the other words, use this box on the top that's just a little bit smaller. These spaced out the way they are on this pattern, well, there's a reason for that, because we are going to stitch this. Well, let me show you on here. We're going to stitch these, and then we're going to cut them out. And so we need some extra fabric around each of these. This is the center of the flower, and our word box, because we're going to fold that fabric to the back. So I need enough room between these elements to have enough fabric to leave some extra and fold it to the back. If you are putting a word on your hoop, here's how you deal with that. Find the word that you want and print out the sheet that has that word on it, and, and then cut out around it. And then same thing, put it behind, and can you see how I can see where it is behind there? I've already traced the box on. And so now I'm going to hold that in place and tape it down. Like that. And same thing. Now I can, like I said, I don't even really need to shine a light behind this, although these words are pretty small, so if it helps to shine a light, do that. So now I can, but anyway, whether you shine a light or not, trace through and put that word on the fabric with the Frixion gel pen. Here is my word traced on. I can take that paper off on the back, and there's the word. And I will be honest with you, these words are pretty small. This is going to be some pretty tiny stitching. So if you really don't want to stitch that small, you can always use a very fine line permanent marker, such as this one. This is a Pigma Micron, and it has a really small point on it. Can you see how, where is it? Can you see it? Tiny, tiny little point on it. And you could, instead of tracing with the Frixion pen, you could write this word, trace this word with this fine line permanent black marker, and then not even stitch it. And that's actually what I did last year on the One Meaningful Word 5 design, is I just wrote it with the black marker and left it like that, and it was fine. Didn't even have to stitch it. I am going to attempt to stitch this one with the darkest blue thread in some really tiny stitches. So we'll see how it goes. I may change my mind and trace this again with the black pen, and we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. I am stitching these letters, and they are indeed very tiny. I am using one strand of the darkest blue DMC, and I am using a split back stitch. The only thing different is that on here on this end of the B, and I'll do it the same on the end of the M, I added a few more little stitches, sort of, to make a little teardrop shape, kind of like it was truly lettered. It's the only thing that's a little different there on that end, but otherwise this is just a very, very teeny tiny split back stitch. And the stitches on the longer areas are a teeny bit longer. The stitches that are up here at the top of the B and the top of the L and down here at the bottom, and they're going to be on these O's, they are really, really tiny. Just like I always say, all the rule still applies. Smaller curves, smaller stitches, and these are really small curves. So just make sure that you are indeed splitting, even though it's one strand, make sure very carefully when you're doing this part right here, when you're going down, that you are indeed splitting that one strand, because it does make a difference. But other than that, it's just straight ahead split back stitch. Make sure you are stitching somewhere where you have lots of good light, because you are not going to be able to see exactly where to put that needle down if you're stitching in kind of a dim room. So just if you don't normally stitch with a bright light shining on your work, just for this part, I would definitely recommend sitting right under, or go outside in the bright sunshine or something, but definitely get some good light on your work while you are stitching this little tiny word. Two things. As I am stitching this O if you have an O or a similar type of letter in your word, you know how it has a, you make a circle and then it has a little loop that loops back around. I am not going to stitch that little loop again inside that O because it'll just completely fill in that teeny tiny space. So I've stitched this O and now I'm going to just skip that little loopy part and I'm going to start my next stitch right here on the outside of the O so that I don't, so you can, it reads like an O. The other thing is if you are finding this DMC thread just too fuzzy and you're just not getting a fine enough line, you can also use just regular sewing thread. Just, you know, just like a polyester sewing thread. It's a little bit less fuzzy than DMC. I mean, even though it's one strand, it still has, you know, some weight to it. So if you're struggling with getting these letters clear when you're stitching, you can just use regular sewing thread as well, instead of the DMC. When you're finished stitching your word, just leave it. Don't stitch the box because that's just going to show us, we're going to use that line later, but don't stitch around it. Leave it in the hoop, leave this fabric in the hoop because now we're going to go stitch the other two things and we want to stitch those first before we take this fabric out of the hoop. Now let's stitch this flower, this kind of wavy, funky 1970s flower. In fact, that's what inspired me for this flower, is some 1970s colors and kind of wavy psychedelic design. So that's where the inspiration for this came from. We're going to start by stitching the petals. And very often I see questions from people about, you know, especially people who are newer to embroidery, with like, where do I start? Which section do I stitch first? And sometimes it doesn't matter, and sometimes it does matter because I choose to decide, or I choose which area to stitch based on if I want some stitches to be underneath other stitches. And on this flower, I know that I'm going to have this center. I'm going to do some techniques that will, I want to sit on top of these petals. The petals are going to be visually and physically underneath the techniques that are going to be done on the center. So I'm starting with the petals. We're going to start on in the center of each petal by satin stitching this blobby section in the center. You can see these finished ones down here. I am using 3 strands of DMC and I am going to satin stitch. When I am deciding which direction to put my satin stitches, very often I let the design of the shape I'm trying to fill inform which direction to go. This shape, I very easily could have gone in, you know, parallel lines that are right next to each other that, you know, sort of follow out from around the center of this flower. So in other words, just looking at this one shape, I could have gone straight up and down all the way across. But it's a little bit weird for these, especially some of them down here that are really skinny. That's a little tricky. Maybe these down here, this, if I had done one long straight satin stitch, that would be really long, like a long way from this point to this point. But also like where they kind of like bulge out here on the sides, that would be a little strange. It would work. You could definitely do it. You know, you could also satin stitch in lines going across this way, but that doesn't seem to read quite as well for a flower. I decided to draw this line down the center, and now I'm going to stitch at an angle around the shape of the petal all the way around towards that center vein, if you want to call it that. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I always tend to start like this on the right side. You can start on the left side. It's not going to make a difference. And I'm making sure that I have a pretty sharp angle right here. I just go down along that center line and I come on the outside edge. Instead of putting my next stitch like right next to, like I would if I was going in parallel line, you know, like like horizontal lines like this, straight up and down. I'm That's a little close if I'm going to make an angle because it would sit on top of that stitch. So I'm going to come up with the needle just a little tiny bit ahead beyond that the stitch I just made, so that when I come down at this very sharp angle, it fills in right there. You'll find you'll just get a knack for how far along on that outside line edge to come up with your needle. And I might have miscalculated on that one because there's a teeny bit of space right there, but you know what? It'll be fine. And as the angle gets a little bit less steep as I come to the outside point or edge of this shape, I can come up a little closer to where the previous stitch was. And this is going to be one of those places as I go around this part where I will perhaps sort of bury my stitches. Obviously get shorter, but I'm going to sort of I've got more room on the outside edge, less room on the inside edge to fit all the same number of stitches. So I'm going to come up. It's a little hard to see because it's so tiny, I know. I'm going to come, let me show you this way, come up on the outside, and instead of going all the way down to here, I'm going to put my needle down a little bit short, make a little bit of a shorter stitch and put it underneath the previous stitch. I'm going to do that again here. See if you can sort of see what I'm doing. I'm not left-handed, but it's easier for you to see. Under a shorter stitch and slightly underneath the previous stitch, and that really adjusts the angle. This stitch could probably be a full stitch now. And then as I work down the other side, I can do the same thing, slightly underneath there. This petal, it's really short stitches up here. When this, the larger petals, the ones that are a little bit longer, it's a little bit easier to see what you're doing. Oh, I really made that one a drastic angle. And then as you come down here, you know, I just keep working around. Sometimes it's a little bit, because now you have to adjust, you know, over here you were used to working at this angle. Now you got to get used to working at this angle. If you wanted to, you could come down here and work up the side of the shape this way, if that helps you get those angles a little bit, figure out where to come up, if that's easier for you, because it's not really going to matter whether you work from the top back down to the center or the center back up to the top. So now that I've started here, I will just continue with that. I think, oh, that one's a little bit far apart. I might go back. See how I have some space in between there? I might go back and fill that one in. I mean, we are not trying to get, you know, exquisitely, perfectly smooth section of satin stitching here. It's a flower. It's okay if it has texture. I think I'm going to run out of thread before I think my thread chicken I'm going to lose today because I'm not sure I have enough thread. Which brings up, I may have talked about this before, satin stitching. You know, you'll notice I'm coming up every stitch. I come up on the outside and go down on the inside, and then I take the thread across the underside of the fabric and I come up on the outside edge and go down. That does use a lot of thread on the back. You may be tempted, so I just went down right there. Can you see I went down on the inside? You might be tempted to come up, you know, just move over a tiny bit and come up and work back out that way, which, you know, it can be done, and probably on this thing, it's fine. As a general rule, I don't do that. First of all, it's super, super tedious. Like I just went down right here. Now, if I try to come up next to it, it takes me way longer to come up just one little teeny fiber over and not pop that thread. See how I popped that stitch out because I came up in the same hole I went down? To me, it's just not generally worth it to spend all that tedious time trying to move over one fiber but not too much. Let me see if I can do it. But occasionally, like right now, since I have very little thread left, and I just need to make one more stitch, and instead of trying to make those last 3 or 4 stitches, or I mean having to switch thread before I make those last 3 or 4 stitches, I will occasionally, switch the directions like that. But generally, as a rule, I don't. I go down and up, and then I go around, and so that the thread is making a loop. Even though you're using up a lot of thread on the back of the fabric, honestly, it just makes your satin stitch lay more smoothly, because the fibers are all going in the same direction, and you'll have a headache from spending all that time trying to come up so close to the previous stitch but not pop that stitch out. For the outside edge of the petal, we're going to really just do the exact same thing. 3 strands of thread and just do a satin stitch to kind of mimic that shape all the way around. And each of these petals has a slightly different shape. Like this one is a little skinnier, this one is short and fat. These down here are like, this one's like really skinny. So like these are little tiny stitches. Each one's going to vary. But that makes it fun because they're not identical. I originally had them, when I drew this, I had drawn them so they were all just alike. The center was dead center and it was all completely symmetrical. And then I was like, that's just so boring. So that's when I switched it to this very wavy 70s inspired kind of strange flower. And when you're satin stitching, when I'm going down, if you don't want any of the fabric to show between 2 colors, I don't think I'm going to outline this turquoisey blue. So when you go down, make sure you go down like right almost into that other color. There might be a reason where you would want to, when you go down next to the color, but as you go all the way around, that will leave a little bit of fabric showing through. Sometimes I'll do that, like I said, if I intend to outline it later. If the design calls for that, you might want to not have the satin stitching go straight down into the color next to it, or the section next to it. But for this one, I want the colors to be, I don't want any of that white fabric to show through. And this one, this flower, since it's kind of more squatty, it's taking, the angle of this satin stitching is a little bit less sharp, a little bit less angled. So, but now as I'm going around here, I'm going to start, I want to make the angles a little bit more. So now I'm going to do a few of those stitches where I make it shorter and go. So see how now my angle is much sharper this way as opposed to being more like that. Now I'll make a complete stitch to sort of cover it. And now I think I'm going to do another one where I go down and underneath. And I think I'm going to do that again so my angle gets even a little more. Change that angle even more. When you do that, every once in a while you got to come make a complete stitch that fills in and kind of covers up where that where you've made those shorter stitches that go underneath. But other than that, this is just exactly the same. Just stitch all the way around the outside edge of this petal. Before I finish stitching this and we move on to the next section, I did want to say that I know some people don't love satin stitch, and if you don't want to do this much satin stitch, you could absolutely fill this in with a different kind of stitch. My first consideration, what I had originally planned to do, was to fill each of these petals in with um, chain stitching that follows the line of these waves. Chain stitching is really good for, curvy, wavy lines. And so, yeah, I could have, instead of, doing a stitch that goes around like this, I could fill these in with chain stitch. Same way with this one if you really wanted to. I didn't want to do that because I think this outside edge is going to be chain stitch, and I didn't want all three sections to have the same texture. I wanted, a different texture in here in the center to make it kind of stand out. But if you don't want to do this much satin stitch, definitely you can change it up. You could do brick stitch. You could do split back stitch, which looks like a chain stitch. You could do chain stitch. So you could fill it in with French knots if you love. You could fill in each of these sections with French knots. That would actually be kind of cool if you just love French knots. So you're not, you don't have to absolutely do satin stitch if you don't want to on this section. When I came over here to work on this petal, it occurred to me that maybe the only really kind of, I hate to use the word difficult because it's not difficult, but the only thing that's a little tricky about satin stitching these petals is figuring out the angles. And this one right here that I'm working on has a really wide base on it. Like this one down here, see how, or that one, or even that one, how the base of the petal is really narrow from here to here, so it's just easy to kind of like make a sharp angle. But this one is a little bit, I had to think about it for a minute. And so here's a little trick that can help you. Instead of starting way down here and filling out or stitching this little area, come up just a little bit and then make your angle like that. So now that gives you something to key off of. So now I can fill in below it. I gotta get that knot out of the way on the back. So now I can fill in below that angle as it goes out towards the widest part of that petal near the center. I can do that quickly for you. Still working at an angle, but it's not touching the blue, the turquoise that's in the center of the petal. So now that section is filled up. Now I can hop back up here and I have this nice sharp angle to continue working around the rest of this petal. So that's just a little trick. It's similar to, drawing guidelines, which you could also do. Drawing guidelines with satin stitching is very helpful, and I do it very often. So if you had, this is a Frixion pen, but you could even do it with like a pencil because it's going to be covered up. I mean, if I wanted to sort of keep track of the angles that I was going to stitch as I worked around, I could do that, and that is a helpful guide as I stitch around to make sure that my stitches aren't getting too horizontal or something. So anyway, either stitch yourself a quick guideline or draw some guidelines, and that I think will help make figuring out those angles a little bit easier. After we stitch the insides of the petals, we are going to stitch around the outside of the petals, both around the whole perimeter of the flower and then in between each petal. I'm using 3 strands of one of the pink threads. I think it's number 917, and I am using a chain stitch. And I like the chain stitch because it's good for kind of curvy, wavy lines. I will say that you want to keep your stitches pretty small, pretty short. I mean, not small, but short, because as always, we're going around curves and we want to follow those curves pretty pretty well. And if you have long, long skinny stitches that are really, stretched out, it's not going to cover this fabric very well, and it's going to be more of a jagged line than a wavy curve like this. Uh, uh, Other than that, it's just really straightforward. I am starting out by chain stitching around the outside edge, and then I will come back and stitch in between the petals, and say on some of these areas, like this will probably just be one row of chain stitching. Up here I might need to do some, a stitch here and a stitch here, but I just want to, however many stitches it takes, or rows or whatever, just cover all of this white fabric between the petals. The other thing about chain stitch is that a lot of people love the reverse chain stitch. I'm doing, I call it the traditional way. I don't know if that's the right term or not. Um, the reverse chain stitch, you can look it up. I generally, I don't know why I am more comfortable doing it this way. I feel like my stitches are more, the tension on my stitches is better, and it's easier to make smaller chain stitches. Sometimes it's hard to do the reverse, because the reverse chain stitch, you make a little stitch and then you make a loop, and then you end up like going underneath a loop like this. Can you see that? And then putting your thread down so you're not coming up inside of the loop. Um, that works great. Sometimes it's hard to do that style of chain stitching when you have stitching right next to it. Like if you're just making a line of chain stitch, reverse chain stitch is great, super easy. If you're trying to do it right next to some stitching, sometimes it's hard to get your needle underneath. Like, see, it's hard, like I catch, whether I go this way or I'm going this way, it's hard to get that needle under that loop without catching some thread. So that's one of the reasons that I like to do the traditional chain stitch. So I just hold that loop open and pull the thread through. Come up wherever I came up. I put the needle straight back down inside that loop, right where I came up. Come up inside this loop. Let me make that smaller so you can see that better. So I went down right where I came up. I'm going to make a loop. Come up inside that loop on the line, just ahead on the line. Pull the thread through the loop and pull the loop tight. The other thing that I find is easier for me for chain stitch is that I tend to work in a sort of a generally line away from me. You can chain stitch left or chain stitch right. That might be more comfortable for you depending on right or left-handed. For some reason I find it's easier to pull the thread and get the tension right on my chain stitches when I am able to pull the thread away from me a little bit. But that is not, however is comfortable for you, that's the way you should chain stitch. And as long as you like the tension, that's all that matters. Whatever is the most comfortable for you. I feel like I didn't make a lot of sense when I was talking about the order in which I was stitching this. So I've stitched all the way around the outside edge, and now I'm coming back and I'm starting in the center, and I'm stitching a straight line up towards the outside edge. And so now when I get up here, see how it's kind of I've got kind of a V shape right here to fill in. If I just put one more stitch, it's not going to really cover. So I'm going to make one stitch that goes over this way to fill in that side. And then see how I have a little bitty little V of space right there of fabric that's showing through. I'm just going to stick another stitch right here, just another chain stitch or daisy stitch, whatever, chain stitch right there to fill in that V of space. Okay, so that's, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. I realized when I got to this point that the centers of these the turquoise sections needed a little something extra. So I am just doing a really simple split back stitch with 2 strands of the lighter turquoise. I didn't want to use 3 strands because I don't necessarily want it to be a thick line down the center there. I just wanted a little pop of color, and I love the split back stitch for just a nice easy continuous line that actually looks like a little bitty chain stitch when you get finished with it, which will echo the chain stitch of the pink that surrounds each petal. So that's just super quick to do. Before I get into the details about how to actually create the cast on stitch, let's talk about needles. Now, I recommend using a milliner's needle to make this cast on stitch. And a milliner's needle, sometimes called a straw needle, is a needle where the eye of the needle is the same width as the shaft. You can also see that it's very long. And the reason this is helpful is because when you are doing any kind of stitch, and bullion stitches this way too, when you are going to be wrapping the thread around the needle multiple times and then pulling that needle through those wrapped threads, it is much, much easier to have a needle that is all one width from the eye to the tip. Let me show you, for instance, here is a number 24 chenille needle, and this one is a number 18 milliner's needle. So let me see if I can hold those there. So you can see the difference. The chenille needle on the right is much shorter, and it has a much wider eye. It's longer, true, but it's also, it bulges out a little bit. And even though it seems like it's a very small difference, it does make a difference when you are trying to pull a needle through multiple wraps. And also it's much shorter, so the length of the milliner's needle is nice because you need some room on that needle to work. And you'll see what I'm talking about later when we do the actual cast on stitch. But let me show you that now. Oh, sorry, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about the needle before we move on, and that is how to get the thread through this eye. And even though this is a pretty large needle and the eye is, a little bit longer, it's not a teeny tiny eye, it is relatively small. And my favorite needle threader that I normally use for like that 24 chenille needle is this one. But you can tell that this one is going to be too wide. It doesn't fit in that eye. So I like to use this one. I carry both of these needle threaders in my shop, but this one is for small eyes. And even though, like I said, this looks like kind of a large, hefty needle, you need something this small to get through the eye of this needle. So to use that, you're going to put that very delicate wire through the eye. Here are my threads. For this, I'm going to be using 3 strands. Put it through that wire, pull that thread through, and here's the part where you're going to pull the thread through the eye. Now, this eye is big enough that it's easier than some needles that have really, really thin eyes, but even nevertheless, this needle threader, even though it's pretty sturdy, I don't hold it back here and just yank. I hold it up here on the wire itself, and then I just pull that thread through. And there you go. Now, there is an alternate way to do this if you don't have a needle threader. I do this sometimes, but honestly, I thread so many needles, I use a needle threader for every single needle and thread that I create. But you can do this, and this is kind of from my needlepoint days. So you hold the thread in one hand, take the needle, you wrap the thread around that needle like that. So see how it's wrapped around? And then you pinch it and you slide it off. So now you have this right here, you have a little loop, but you're not dealing with the cut edges. You've got a little loop. So you pinch that really hard, and if you're lucky, then you can press the eye through or onto. Okay, but that's why I don't really like this method. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so I would have to start again, start over, wrap it around. Maybe this time they'll be a little bit more compact. And I'm going to try to push that eye over those loops. And I think I was successful that time. All right. So you can do that, but like I said, I just use a threader every single time so that I am not constantly messing with it might work or it might not. So let me show you how to do a basic cast on stitch. And I like to work my cast on stitches so that I'm working vertically. Even if this, well, let me explain. So let's say that I want my stitch to go from here to here. All right, so that's going to be my stitch length right there. And I am going to have, this creates like a little scallop or a little ruffle. And let's say I want the ruffle to be right here, like that. All right, it's going to be sort of three-dimensional, but it's going to lay on the fabric that direction. But what I'm really paying attention to is here's my stitch length. It starts here and ends there. So I am going to take my thread. Like I said, I'm using 3 strands here, but you can use different numbers of strands. Sometimes you might want to use 6 if you really want a bulkier stitch, but I'm going to come up at the top end of this stitch. I always start with the needle coming out at the for the way it's oriented for me at the top, and I'm going to go down back into the fabric at the bottom. And now I'm not going to pull that thread all the way through. I am going to push on the back of the fabric, and I'm going to come back up right, wait a minute, try to get that knot out of the way. It's a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to come up right where that thread came up originally. And so now I'm going to push that needle up a little bit. Let me move my hoop a little bit so I've got more room. Just a second. All right, hopefully that gives me a little bit more room. So now what I have done is I have left a lot of thread here. I know it's hard to see the whole length of the thread, which brings me to a tip to make sure you're not working with a really short amount of thread. Go ahead and cut a pretty good long length of thread because you need a lot of thread to work because you're going to be manipulating it with this other hand. So don't start out with like a 12-inch piece of thread. This is a brand new thread. I generally work with a length that's 30 to 36 inches long. So this is a brand new thread, so it's really long. All right, so I'm going to hold it with this hand. All right, I'm going to put this finger so that my fingertip is pointing up, and then I'm going to hold the rest of the threads with that, the rest of the threads with these fingers. Okay, so it has a little bit of tension on it. All right, get a good grip on it here. I'm gonna, sometimes you can like push from the back. Sometimes I like to get my other hand under there. All right. I'll put this finger, the other finger underneath it so it's off the fabric right here. So I'm going to put this fingertip up like that. I'm going to turn that finger over. A little bit hard to see here because I have to turn my finger over. All right. So now see that little triangle right there that forms? See that triangle? I am going to twist this finger, push the tip of that needle up, and I am going to hook just like that. Do you see where the needle went in? All right, so like I said, I can either put this finger back here, I can push from the back a little bit, and I'm going to pull perpendicular to the needle. I'm going to pull the thread out this way. I am going to pull it so that it's up against the needle. I'm not going to pull it so tight that I'm just choking up on that needle. But let's look at that again. Put your fingertip up, hold the rest of the threads with the other fingers, flip your finger over, loop the tip of the needle underneath there, and pull the thread across. So keep doing that until you have as many stitches cast on, that's why it's called a cast on stitch, as many stitches as you think it will take to fill this length from here to here. from here to here. If you want this stitch to lay flat against the fabric, just estimate whatever this width is, make the length of these the same. You want to be careful that these little, this little edge right here is not flipping over. See how it's flipped over to the left now? I want to make sure that it stays on that side, and you don't want it to get, to change direction. You want it to all be on one side. I can maybe zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. See how those are all on one side? You do not want them to flip over there. All right. I am going to do, I think, maybe one more. Let's just see if that works. Okay, so that's where I am now. So now I'm going to hold gently right here. And now I'm going to zoom back out for you so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. All right, now I'm going to hold gently and I'm going to pull that needle through. That's why that needle being all one width is helpful. So now I sort of switch my thumb so that I'm pinching, I'm kind of pulling up towards me, and I'm going to sort of gently pinch that stitch so that all those little stitches all stay heading that direction. And now I'm going to slowly pull the stitch towards me, and you have to kind of pinch it so you can get that thread. And I'm going to hold the end and keep pulling. Now the thread is laying on the fabric, and now I'm pulling towards me this direction. Previously I was pulling up, like towards the ceiling. Now I'm pulling flat on the fabric, like towards my body. And I will often like put a little finger there and pull. That will help keep everything in line. All right, now see how that little stitch is formed? I'll take my needle and I will go down at the end of the stitch. And there's my first cast on stitch. Let me show you again. Come up at the top, go down, push on the back of the thread so you can get the tip of that needle to come up right where the thread comes out of the fabric. Either put a finger behind the needle or push it from the back. Fingertip up, roll your finger, loop it over the tip of the needle. 3, 4. Okay, see what happened right there? See how that it twisted? And the more, like if you do a cast on stitch and then you move to another one and then move to another one, the more you do, the more your thread is going to get twisted, and it's going to want to do that more and more. Do you see how it flopped over to the left side? I don't want that. I want to make sure it stays on that side. Oops, make sure I'm grabbing the right one. All right, so they're all back on the right side. I'm going to keep casting on. Oh, it flipped again. Sometimes I will move this other finger down, and it kind of helps to, it's pressing against those, and so it will help keep them in place. See how now they're not wanting to flip? I'm going to do more. I'm going to cast on more this time, because the effect that you get for that, if you cast on more stitches than the length that you've prescribed for your stitch, now you'll get more of a little loop. It'll stand up more. It'll be more curved because it's not going to lay flat. It's going to raise up from the fabric. So there's my stitches cast on. I'm going to gently pinch it, pull that needle through. Now I'm going to, as I pull it through, I'm going to start pulling it towards the ceiling, and then I'm going to sort of fold it over and start pulling that thread towards my body. And now I'm going to put my fingernail up there against there, and I'm going to sort of push. And now I'm going to go down at the end of the stitch. So now you can see how this one is more of a curve. Now, I mentioned how the thread likes to twist. It's a little bit hard to see as we're so close up, but now between every single stitch, I will hold my thread up. A little hard to see what's happening. It's already untwisted. I'll hold my thread somewhere, like hold the hoop up, and I'll let that thread dangle so that it will untwist. From now on, every single cast on stitch that I do, it's going to want to twist. This one's really bad about that. So make sure you're constantly letting your needle hang so the thread will untwist. Let me do that for you one more time so you can see without me talking throughout the whole thing. Up at the top, down at the bottom, come up where the thread came out originally. Twist it around my finger over the tip. 2, 3. Oh, well, I lied. I'm going to talk. Okay, see how sometimes as you're pulling it down, if that flips down, I will zoom in again for you. See how that has flipped down? And if I pull on it, it's like on top of the wraps, the cast on stitches that I've already done. And now it's all messed up. This one's probably going to be completely messed up. I don't know if I can fix it. See if I can get, okay, so now it's back in line. Now it's going to slide down and be on top of the one I just did. So I'll do another cast on. It's wanting to twist, but if I keep pulling it gently, just make sure when you're pulling it right here that this loop that's happening is not happening on top of the previous stitches. You want it next to, but not on top of. So I'm going to make this one a flat one. So I think I've got enough to fill in that space. I'm going to gently hold here, pull the needle through, pull up towards the ceiling, and then gradually fold it over towards me. Put my fingernail up against it, hold it, pull this thread towards my body, and then put the needle down. So that is the basic cast on stitch. So as neat and cool as that is just by itself, there's some other things, or another thing you can do with a cast on stitch. You can make this ruffle wider. You can make it longer from here to here. How do we do that? We are going to use this right here. This is a little tube from, where is my example? There it is. Okay, this is, guess what? It is the shaft of this cheapo cotton swab. This is not a brand name Q-tip cotton swab because they have a nice heavyweight like cardboard paper shaft. This one is a cheapo cotton swab bag from the dollar store, because when you clip it here and here, you will end up with this really cool small little tube. So what I'm going to do when I want to make a wider cast on stitch, I'll do the same thing. I'll come up, go down, come back up, but now I'm going to slide this tube over the end of the needle. And you might have trouble seeing me because it's so close to the top there. Let me move this down. All right. So now we're going to do the exact same thing, except now instead of having only the size of the needle, we've got this slightly larger tube. So same thing though, wrap it around, come down. You have to be a little more careful, like down here where the tube, don't let the tube slide up the needle, hold it in place with this finger. And it's the same. It's really just the same. Just make sure that you're pulling that first stitch snug enough. But now when I do my cast on stitches, it's a little confusing because the whole entire stitch itself is called the cast on stitch. And then I also call each of these wraps a cast on. The thread is really wanting to twist on me. All right, so I think that's maybe long enough. All right, same thing though. I'm going to hold it gently. Now I'm going to slide the tube off and now slide the needle through. Everything's the same though. Holding that down. And now when I pull it, you'll see in that stitch. Now you can see that it's much wider. It's wider from here to here. Get you where you can see again. All right, you see the difference in this one and this one. This one is really cool. This one is wider. That's why this one is an excellent candidate for petals, like rose petals. And for that, let me show you how to make a flower shape, a rose, although it could be used for other things too. But let me show you how to make a flower using this style of cast on stitch. If you wanted to make a flower or a flower center or a rose, you would use this cast on stitch and do it in a circle. So let's say we're going to start with a circle like that. That's sort of the basic shape. But you could have stitches just sit end to end around this circle, and that would be fine. If you want to make it look a little bit more like a rose, we're going to overlap the stitches. So let's start out with a stitch that goes, I'm just going to go ahead and draw like the straight version of the stitch. All right, we would do one from here to here, considering, let's say this would be the top where we'd come up and go down, and we'd have our cast on stitch sit that way. Then the next one we would come along, and instead of starting it having the stitch meet the end of that, we would go at a slightly different angle and have it be right here. That would be where we would come up, go down, and have our cast on stitches be over here. And then this one would start about halfway and go like that until you'd worked your way around doing cast on stitches like this. Let me show you kind of what that looks like. So let's say we're going to start with this one. Up, down. I'm going to turn my hoop because I work best when everything is more straight on. All right, so now I can work a little more straight. Okay, so down, push that needle up. And I am going to, I'm not going to do the little tube. I'm just going to do regular semi-flat. So here we go. So now I'm going to do my wraps. But I do want these to have, each one of these to sit in a sort of a curve above the surface of the fabric. So I'm going to make the number of wraps so that it is longer than the length of that line that I drew. And you can adjust a little bit how wide, even without the tube, you are with how loose your stitches are. You may want a very loose, ruffly effect. That would be something to just play around with. So maybe, I haven't even been counting. I don't even know how many that is. I'll just do one more just because. All right, so there's all of those cast on stitches. Pull it through and lay it on the fabric. Keep pulling until it's snug. Push my fingernail against it to get it a little bit curved. And go down. All right, there's my first one. It's not perfect, but that's all right because rose petals are kind of ruffly on the edges. Now I'm going to turn my hoop again in my stand so that this line is now straight. So I'm going to sort of, in fact, I'm not even going to follow that line because I made that one so curved. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come up halfway. See how I'm coming up in the middle of that little, the previous cast on stitch that I did. Oh wait, totally wrong. Did that wrong. Forget that. I want to come up at the top, not the bottom. All right, forget that. Come up at the top. I need to let my thread unwind first a little bit. Okay, come up at the top of where I want the next stitch to be. And now I'm going to go down halfway, you know, halfway point of that previous stitch. Oh man, I messed up again. I am not thinking about what I'm doing. I gotta go fix that. Just a minute. Okay, totally not thinking about what I was doing there. Okay, I've come up. I'm going to put the needle in. Now I'm going to come up. Now I'm going to wrap again. One. I probably should have counted how many wraps I did on that first one so it could be the same. I honestly have no idea how many it was. I'm just going to sort of make an educated guess that it's roughly the same length, although it doesn't have to be. These could be different, you know, sizes, because not every petal is the same. Maybe one more. Who knows? Okay, there we go. I'm going to pull it through. Lay it on the fabric, hold my fingernail against it, like that, until it's tight. Put that needle down. So there's my second stitch. And so now the end of that stitch, sometimes you're going to have to just sort of play with them, is now sort of layered on top of the previous stitch. Now I'm going to turn my hoop around again. Let me move this. So that I am going to come up here. I'm actually not going to follow the lines that I drew. Sorry about that. That's why I don't usually draw the stitch lines. I am going to go up. Now I'm going to put the needle down. Turn that hoop a little bit more. Okay. Go down. I'm not going to forget to leave the needle in the fabric this time. Come up and wrap. Guess you should say twist and wrap, right? All right, I think maybe that's enough wraps. Pull it through, lay it down. And there is that one. So, it's a little confusing with all those lines, but let me zoom in for you. All right, see how we're starting to form that rose or that flower or whatever it is you're trying to make. You can kind of mess with the scallops so they're not squished up against the fabric. But you would just continue doing that all the way around. You can do one round, you can do multiple rounds to make your flower larger. You could use different colors as you go around. Lots of options for this cast on stitch for roses, flowers, whatever you're trying to do. But anyway, this is a really cool stitch to learn, and I hope you enjoy doing it yourself. All right, have fun with your cast on stitches. So as you hopefully just saw in that tutorial for the cast on stitch, you can use that stitch to make overlapping cast on stitches that can look like a rose. And that is what we are going to do here in the center of the flower. Now we're not going to make a rose obviously, but I am going to do rings of overlapping cast on stitches to give this some dimension. And my original idea, I knew I wanted the center to be raised or three-dimensional in some way. And I originally was going to do it separately, stitch it, cut it out, and attach it on top of this so it would have some more dimension. But I just scrapped that whole idea. That was a little too complicated. And I just thought there's a better way to get some dimension on this without having to do a whole separate center. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, unlike the example in that cast on stitch tutorial, this is not a circle. It is an oval, as I think you can see. And so we are going to have to adjust the length of our stitches as we work around this irregular shape. It's not completely round. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to have rings of stitches so we can use different colors. And the outside ring is going to be the dark green. So let's just, this is not the stitch lines, this is just kind of where the ring is going to fall. So we are going to have the first ring fall right inside this edge. That'll be the darkest green. And then we're going to do another ring of the next lightest green. Then we're going to do another ring of the next lightest green. And because this shape, this area from here to here is narrower, we're not going to do a complete ring of the last color. We're just going to do a partial line that goes from about here to here. So that's not just one stitch. That's going to be maybe 2 or 3 stitches. We'll just have to see how much room we end up with. But that is just, now it's confusing because of all those rings, but I'm just trying to show you sort of the plan ahead of time. Now, because, as I mentioned, I like to work cast on stitches with the needle going up this direction because it's easiest to handle the needle and the thread as you're wrapping it, we're going to not leave the flower in this same position for the whole time. I am going to continually move the hoop around so that I can always have my needle going straight up. So the hoop will move. I won't have to be, doing a stitch this direction. I can always be doing it this direction. The other consideration about this, that's just a teeny bit different, is that because we have an oval and not a round, the stitches like on this side and the top side right here can be longer, and then as we work our way around these two sort of squished sides, the cast on stitches will be a little bit shorter. So let me show you what I mean by that. One thing I forgot to mention before we get started is that this little area is an excellent place to practice before you come to here. Not that it's going to be a disaster if something goes wrong in here, rip it out. It's fine. But I love to have a practice hoop if I'm feeling a little unsure about something. So, sorry for the chaos, but here's my practice hoop. This is like, I don't know, this is 4, 5, 6 designs that I have. So you can tell over here I was testing out the ferns, or that's for later. But anyway, see right here, this was me testing out how to deal with all of these cast on stitches. You can tell I didn't even, like, it goes like this. I didn't even do the whole ring. I was just seeing how it was going to look, how many I could fit in, how the colors look. And so consequently, this provided me with a lot of practice on these cast on stitches so that, the first ones were kind of weird and I was kind of unsure about them. As I kept doing it, I don't know how many stitches there are here, but this was some good practice. And like I said, I didn't even have to complete it. It was just getting a feel for doing these stitches on top of each other. So I highly recommend having a hoop with just some scrap fabric in it, just keep it in there, and just whenever you need to test something before you go to your final hoop, your final fabric, then it's a good opportunity to not only get a warm up or refresh your memory about a stitch, you can make sure it's all going to work so that when you come to here, you've got lots of practice and you know what you're doing. So remember when I said it's okay if you do something on the actual hoop and you have to end up ripping it out? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I had started, even though I had practiced on my practice hoop, I had started on the outside ring, and as I was trying to keep going further towards the center, it was just becoming too difficult to avoid the other stitches that I'd already done. It worked on my practice hoop, but that hoop didn't have other stitching right up next to it, and that fabric was a lot looser, which brings me to this. Normally, I preach all the time, your fabric must be drum tight. Your stitches are more accurate and all that. You always want it tight. This is the one time where it's going to be helpful to have that fabric a little bit looser. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see how loose it is now, and it'll probably get looser as I work because I'm really having to push up to get that needle through and to come out right where I want it. But you'll see that more as I do this. So anyway, back to starting on the outside ring. I did that, did a whole ring, and I decided that was just becoming too unwieldy. So I ripped all of that out, so that's why you may see some holes here. So now I'm going to start on the inside, not the very, very center. That's going to be different. But I'm going to start on this lightest color of green, and I'm going to do this partial line that's like this little half circle that goes right here. It's going to be 2 cast on stitches. Now, as I also mentioned before, I am going to turn my hoop so that, let me get this so it's about right, and I will readjust it so you can see. All right, so now this is the line that I'm going to follow with 2 stitches, so it's roughly going to be vertical, so I can stitch like that. Let me get this, move that over. All right, so now I'm going to start right here. I'm going to start with the stitch that's closest to me. Come up there. Go down. I didn't quite get that. I'm going to adjust that a little bit more. All right, now I can, now this is the part where the fabric, it's helpful when if it's looser, because you have to really push up and get that needle to come up where you want it. It's always hard at first because you're trying to avoid the knot that's on the back. It's easier when there's no other stitches around it, so that was pretty easy. Okay. But this is good. So now this is going to be my first stitch. I'm going to do 6 because I don't want, these to be exactly flat. I want them to have a little bit of a curve, so I'm going to make sure they're just a teeny bit longer than the stitch length that's showing there. So that's the first one. So now I'm going to come do this stitch right here. So I will turn this hoop a little bit again. I think it's going to be about like that. Okay, now I can sort of push that one out of the way. I can come up that end. So now I have pushed this one up and to the left so that I can, and see how I'm going to go down halfway on the halfway mark of that stitch right there. Now this is the part where I have to get the needle up. Shorter stitches are a little bit harder because you've got less fabric to push up from behind. But anyway, so this is my second stitch. That's 5, 6, I'll do 7. Maybe one more. It's probably too many, but it'll be all right. So now it's going to come in behind that previous stitch. So now when I push them down, you can see how they are overlapping. So now it's time for me to change thread colors and come back and do, now I'm going to do a complete ring of the next darkest shade of green. Since I'm doing a complete ring, it doesn't really matter where I start. So I think I'll just start underneath. Since my hoop is already positioned right here, I'm going to start here below the first 2 lighter green stitches that I did, think I forgot to mention, I'm using 3 strands for all of these cast on stitches, for all of these greens. So I am going to just put a stitch in. I'm not gonna try to be so like way up underneath there. I can come out a little bit because you got to remember this stitch is gonna, you know, lay on top of this one. So I want to come a little bit a ways. Can you see that? Wonder if I can get that to come in a little bit more. So see how I am not like all up inside that stitch. I am out a ways, just a teeny bit like that. But I have pushed those stitches to the side. Now this is kind of a long, boy, that is loose. Hang on. Okay, hopefully that's a little steadier. So I'm on the long section of this oval, so I can make this stitch pretty long. Maybe even longer than that. So now I'm going to push from the back and get that needle to come up there. Go through. And now I can do, wrapped it around. Let's fold that behind there. Okay, let me get situated. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, oops, 8. Boy, that got twisted, didn't it? 8, I'm going to do 9. Like that. Now I'll push this one up and I'm going to move up ahead of it and start working around this side. So I'll move my hoop around again. Hang on. So if I'm gonna see, I want it to be about like that. So hopefully that'll be just enough. So this one is gonna be pretty long because it's still. I'm pushing from the back, and honestly, once you get the hang of the, you know, this, how to do this part, the trickiest part of this is getting that needle, especially as you get more and more of these stitches here and you're kind of trying to avoid more of them. The trickiest part is just keeping the other stitches out of the way and bringing that needle up in the right spot. Which is why I switched from working on the outside, starting with the outside ring, to starting on the inside ring, because this way you can shove those stitches to the left and out of the way a little bit more easily than you can if you're trying to work from the outside in. So I'm not even counting anymore, I'm just kind of eyeing it. So I'm going to work all the way around. I'll show you one more stitch because this one's going to be a short one. So I need to move it again. I will move that one, flip it over to the other side. So now I'm going to do a short stitch that goes from here and wraps around this side of that previous stitch. Come on. All right, so this one's going to be a short one, so that's coming up. So see how short that is right there? Not a lot of, much shorter than what I've done so far. So this one might only have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. think it needs at least 6 so that it will be curved. Yeah, that's plenty. All right. Ooh, do not knot up on me. And I have a little, nope, nope, wait. Ah, it worked itself out. That's not really where you want a knot, when you want a knot to arise. All right, so there's that one, and so now I can continue working around. I'll come back here, I'll do some more, and I'll show you what it looks like when there's more of these done. I'm on my third color of green. So I did a partial line and then a complete ring, and I'm on another complete ring. And remember when I talked about how far out to make your rings? Well, now that I'm getting closer to the side, I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough room because I have this complete ring to do, and then I have one more ring after this one. So I want to make sure I have just a little bit of fabric there. Of course, you can come up, in these blue stitches, which is fine. But just don't make sure you're leaving yourself enough room, okay? I keep mentioning how it is helpful to turn the hoop so that you're always working with the needle being vertical. And I am working in a hoop stand. If you don't have a hoop stand, that's okay. You don't have to have one for this. But it is nice to have both hands free when you're working on stitches like this, where you're holding the needle with one hand and doing the thread with the other hand. But I was going to show you guys that I'm not sure if these are going to be released, if they're going to be available by the time this stitch along comes out. I'm hoping so. If not, it'll be very soon after, but I'm really, really hoping to show you guys or have these available for you all when this is out. But this is something that I have been working on along with my husband for 3 years now, maybe. We've been perfecting this, and it is this Lolli and Grace hoop stand. And one of the many things that I love about it, and this was something I requested for us to figure out how to do, is to easily and quickly be able to turn your hoop. Take it out, rotate it, move the hoop around, and pop it back in. So this way I didn't want to mess with, nuts and screws that you had to, laboriously turn to quickly get that hoop out of there. So this is coming in handy maybe more than any other time that I've been working on something, because I'm constantly moving this hoop around to get it to be at the right angle for my cast on stitches. So like I said, hopefully these are going to be available when the stitch along is out. I'm really hoping. But anyway, I just wanted to show you how convenient that is. And here are all of those cast on stitches finished. And because I kept, pushing them over to the inside, close, towards the center, so I could do the next stitch, they're all facing inwards. What I want to do now is see if I can get them to, it's going to take a little bit of work. I'm going to use not the sharp end, but the blunt end. Let me get a different needle. I have this huge needle. I'm going to work to get them to all kind of lay now out towards the outside edge, because what I want to do now, having to push them pretty hard, is open up that little center spot right there. So you can keep pushing these out till you've opened up that hole in the center. That one can really push down. All right, because come on, open up. We are now going to put some French knots in the center here. Hopefully these will stay out of the way while I'm doing these French knots. And because we have the milliner's needle available to us, French knots are also easier with a milliner's needle for the same reason, because it's a stitch where you wrap the thread a number of times, although fewer times than we were on the cast on stitch or you would on a bullion stitch, but you're still wrapping that needle with the thread and trying to pull the needle through some wraps. And because it's all one width, much, much easier. 3 strands here. This is the lightest pink, and I'm just going to do, I'm going to do some French knots with this light pink, and I'm going to come back and add a few in of a darker pink. I'm going to wrap the needle 2 times for each of these knots. It's not like I can fit a whole bunch of knots in here. So there's 1, 2. I always hold my finger right there so that that thread doesn't get all twisted up on itself. All right, if you really push that back, like really, oops, I don't want to, I don't even know how many knots I'm going to get in here. Not that many. 1, 2. I'm going to put a third one. I might try to get 4 of these light pink ones in here, and then see how many of the dark pink ones I can fit. Let me see how much room I have in there. You know, I might just leave it at 3. 3 of the light pink, and so now I'm going to come back in and do the dark pink. Just to make this flower extra special, let's add some beads around this center. And that brings us to the third needle that we're going to use for this project, which is this very small, can you see that? Very small beading needle. We went from the very large milliner's needle to this very small beading needle. And the reason we need to use this is because the beads we're going to use have very small holes. And the eye, we can't even use the 24 chenille needle because the eye on that is too big to go through the holes of these beads. We are using bugle beads, and we're using a size 11, 11, 0, however, I'm not sure how you say it, seed beads, which is one of the most common sizes. But we are going to attach these bugle beads. Let me show you what we are using. I like this, I keep a little dish and I just pour out just a few beads, about as many as I think I'm going to use, and I just leave them here, a little shallow white dish. Nice because you can see the beads, but you can see the purple bugle beads and the green seed beads. So to attach these bugle beads coming out from underneath this center, I'm going to come up, I'm going to shove, sort of shove over that the cast on stitching that we already did, because I kind of want these bugle beads to come out from underneath. So I'm going to come up from behind that cast on stitch, and I'm going to bring that thread all the way out. Speaking of which, I'm using 1 strand of, I think this is the lightest green, doesn't really matter, just choose one of the greens. And then I am going to put a a bugle bead, and I'm going to string it all the way down and push it all the way till it's in position. I found this is really the best way. Go ahead and put it in position. Now I'm going to put 1 seed bead on my needle, and I will send it almost all the way down. And now I'm going to run that needle back through the bugle bead and down into the fabric, and pull it slowly enough so that so that the thread does not twist up and get twisted underneath there. And then now once I pull it tight, that bugle bead is held on with the seed bead. So all you have to do is go all the way around and then once they're done, I'll kind of fluff them up so they sort of stick up, because they're a little hard to see on that dark color, but if you push them up a little bit, they have kind of more of a 3-dimensional effect. All right, so that's a really fun way to add some interest to the center of this flower. I think I neglected to tell you that this very small needle is called a number 10 short beading needle, and that's because there are beading needles that are for jewelry that are very long. And you can use those for this, but they're super long, and so they're kind of unwieldy to try to get through the fabric. So this one is really more for sewing beads onto fabric. but like I said, it has a very small, very tiny eye in order to go through the holes of the beads, which makes it difficult to thread, which is where this needle threader, over here so you can see that wire, it's the same one we used for the milliner's needle, once again comes in extremely handy. It's really easy to get this threaded, this little teeny tiny hole right there, the eye of the needle. This wire will go through that. So as I mentioned before, I do carry these in the shop because I found them hard to find when I was looking for them. And so once I found them, I finally decided to carry them in my shop. But I think you'll find that threader really, really handy. Okay, so now that we have the word stitched and the flower, all we need to do for the moment is to go ahead and take this fabric out of the hoop, because we're going to move on next for the next part and stitch the purple fabric that has the mushroom and the ferns on it and the rest of it. So we'll be coming back to these two things a little bit later in another part. So just like I said, just take it out of this hoop, maybe put this fabric in a plastic bag or something, or just someplace maybe where it won't get dusty, because it'll be just a little while until we're ready to use it again. All right, so that is all for this part.